In the autumn of 2011, on a high stone ridge in central Norway called Lomseggen, the ice did something it had not done within the memory of anyone in the valley below. It shrank. A body of old hard ice named Lendbreen, wedged into a north-facing hollow close to 1,900 meters above sea level, pulled back from its own lower edge and left a margin of wet gravel and broken rock steaming faintly in the thin mountain sun. That summer had been one of the warmest ever recorded in the Norwegian high country, and across the region ice that had held its shape for centuries was giving up ground. Most of what the melt exposed was stone. On Lendbreen, in the meltwater at the foot of the patch, it was something else. A piece of cloth, folded and slumped where the ice had set it down, dark with age and heavy with water, woven in a pattern far too regular to be an accident of nature. It was a garment, and it had been lying on that mountain, held inside that ice, for a very long time. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The archaeologist who would come to know that garment better than anyone was Lars Pilø, who worked for the county authority in Oppland, the mountainous district that Lendbreen belongs to. Pilø was part of a small program built for an unusual purpose, to recover whatever the melting ice of the high country was beginning to surrender before the weather could take it apart again. The Tunic went down off the mountain and into a laboratory. What came back, once the wool had been dated, reset the question completely. This was not a lost coat from a hard winter a century or two ago. The route it had been left on, and the people who had used that route, had gone missing from the record so thoroughly that no map drawn in the last 500 years knew the place had ever been anything at all. Consider the garment itself first, because it belongs to a class of object that almost never survives. The Lendbreen tunic is a simple pullover, a knee-length shirt of woven wool with an opening for the head and nothing in the way of buttons or fastenings, the kind of thing a working person would have pulled on over the shoulders and worn until it fell apart. The weave is a diamond twill, a deliberate diagonal pattern that takes skill and a proper loom to produce, made from the wool of sheep in 2 natural shades. It had been mended. At least 2 patches were worked into it where the cloth had thinned or torn, the repairs sewn by a different hand or at a different time than the original making, so that the tunic carried a small record of its own use in its seams. When a fragment of the wool was measured by radiocarbon dating, it returned an age in the region of 17 centuries, placing its making somewhere around the year 300, in the stretch of the past that archaeologists in Scandinavia call the Roman Iron Age. It is one of the oldest garments ever recovered in Norway. Textiles of that age almost never come down to us in one piece. They survive, when they survive at all, as scorched fragments in a grave or a few flattened threads pressed into a bog, because cloth is among the first things to rot once its owner is finished with it. A whole wearable tunic, its weave and its repairs and its shape all intact after 1700 years, is the sort of thing the ground almost never permits, and the ice permitted it only by never once thawing until the summer it finally did. It would have fit a slim adult of average height. No one knows whose it was, or why a shirt still sound enough to be worth patching was left lying on a glacier at 1900 meters, in a place where the loss of an outer layer could kill a person. The tunic was only the beginning, as the program returned to Lendbreen season after season, working the narrow window in late summer when the melt runs highest and the newly bared ground lies briefly clear. The count of recovered objects climbed past 1,000. Laid out together, they did not describe a single lost traveller. They described a road, not one of stone or gravel, but a route across the ice and the passes on either side of it, used and maintained and known, running over the roof of the mountains between the valley systems below. Along the approach, and across the ground the ice had covered, stood cairns, deliberate stacks of piled stone raised to mark the way when snow or cloud closed in, and the path itself disappeared beneath the feet of the people walking it. Near the highest point of the crossing lay the remains of a shelter built of stone, a place where someone caught out by the weather could wait it out. The objects scattered along the line of the route were the ordinary wreckage of movement, horseshoes, the bones of horses and their frozen dung, preserved where the animals had stood, the broken frame of a wooden sled, walking sticks cut and trimmed for the climb, a knife, a wooden whisk of the kind used to stir milk or porridge, dropped once and never picked up, a leather shoe, scraps of woven cloth and the remains of mittens, the small, ordinary losses of people crossing cold country with their hands full and their attention on the ground ahead. None of it matched the picture the written record had handed down. In the histories and the surviving maps, the high passes of the Norwegian interior were not arteries. They were the blank ground between the settled valleys, crossed rarely and only in desperation. Lendbreen said otherwise. The sheer volume of the material, and its range, from the iron shoes of pack animals to a child-sized mitten to a farmer's kitchen tool, described a working route in steady and unremarkable use for the moving of goods and livestock and people across a span of time that the objects themselves would eventually prove to be far longer than anyone had any reason to expect. The work of measuring that span fell to the same program that had gathered the objects, and it was done the slow way, one radiocarbon date at a time. In 2020, Pihlöö and his colleagues, among them the archaeologist Espen Finstad, and, from the University of Cambridge, the medieval specialist James Barrett, set out their account of the site in the journal Antiquity. They had dated around 60 of the finds, spreading the samples deliberately across the full range of object types, so that the timeline they built rested on the things themselves and not on a guess. The pattern that came back was specific. The earliest activity on the route ran back to roughly the year 300, the same window as the Tunic. Traffic across the pass built through the centuries that followed and reached its height around the year 1000, in the age of the Viking expansions, when the movement of people and goods through the Norwegian interior was at its most intense. Then it fell away. By the 1500s, the route had gone out of use, and the objects stopped. The mix of what turned up said something about what the crossing had been for. Some of it was the equipment of people moving livestock up to the high summer pastures and back down again, the seasonal rhythm of mountain farming that had gone on in that country for as long as there had been farms in it. Some of it pointed further afield, to the movement of goods between regions that had no easier way to reach one another than straight over the high ground. The pass had served both the short local journey and the long haul, and it had done so for long enough that the habit of crossing there must once have been an ordinary thing, known to ordinary people, carried in the memory of a whole chain of generations who saw nothing remarkable in it at all. What gives that timeline its weight is what sits on the other side of it, in the written record, which is nothing whatsoever. A route that had carried traffic for more than 1,000 years, marked with cairns and furnished with a shelter, used heavily enough to leave over 1,000 recoverable objects behind in the ice, does not appear as a known crossing in the maps and documents of the centuries that came after it emptied. The knowledge of it was simply gone. The people who used it left their objects, and then the memory of the crossing itself dropped out of the record and never came back, so completely that when the ice returned the Tunic in 2011, there was no written source to hold it against, no name for the pass, no line on any chart to say that anyone had ever gone that way. The route had existed longer than most nations have existed. It vanished from the record more thoroughly than most single years of history ever managed to. The ice remembered. The archive did not. Why the route ended is a question the objects can frame but cannot fully answer, and the honest version of the account holds that uncertainty open rather than smoothing it over. Two forces arrived in the same span of centuries, either of which would have been enough on its own to empty a high mountain pass, and together they were far more than enough. The first was the climate. The warm centuries that had made the crossing worthwhile gave way, late in the medieval period, to a long cooling that thickened the ice and dragged out the winters, until the same route that had been passable in the Viking Age became harder, and then, for the purpose of ordinary traffic, no longer worth the risk. The second came in the year 1349, when the plague reached Norway. The dying was catastrophic. Whole valleys lost so many people that farms fell silent and stayed silent for generations, and a narrow, specialized piece of local knowledge, the knowledge of how to cross one particular mountain safely and why the crossing was worth making, is exactly the kind of thing that does not survive when the people who carry it die in a single terrible season. A route is not only a path on the ground, it is a thing held in the heads of the people who use it, and when enough of them are gone, the path can remain and the route itself can still be lost. By the time the modern world came looking, there was nothing left on the surface to find, and no reason to go looking for it. The ice had closed over the highest stretch of the crossing and held it. The memory had died with the generations who carried it, and for 500 years the whole of it, the objects and the knowledge alike, stayed sealed in a place no one had any cause to visit. It took a warming climate to break the seal. The same rising temperatures now stripping ice from mountains all over the world are the only reason any of this has surfaced at all, which places the entire discovery on a clock that cannot be wound back and cannot be stopped. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Lendbreen does not stand alone, and this is the part of the account that lifts it out of the category of a single strange survival into something with a pattern behind it. The same program that worked Lendbreen has surveyed dozens of other ice patches across the Norwegian high country, and taken together the ground has given back thousands of objects, the largest collection of finds of its kind anywhere in the world. Most of them are tied not to travel but to hunting. For thousands of years, reindeer in the Norwegian mountains climbed onto the ice patches in the heat of summer to escape the biting flies, and for just as long the hunters climbed up after them, because a herd standing on open ice is a herd with nowhere left to hide. At sites across the Jotunheimen range, the melt has laid bare the hunters' equipment where it fell. Arrows, hundreds of them, their wooden shafts intact, and in some cases the feathers and the sinew binding still attached, lying where they missed their mark and slid down into the snow. Scaring sticks, thin poles once set in long rows to funnel the animals toward the waiting bowmen. The ice held not only the objects but the order of them, the older losses lying deeper and the newer ones nearer the surface, so that at one site the researchers cut a tunnel straight into the ancient ice to read those layers directly. The oldest of the finds run back not centuries but thousands of years, some of them approaching 6,000 years old, into a past that left no writing of any kind behind it, preserved by nothing more elaborate than a cold that never once lifted. The most complete thing the ice has ever handed back did not come from Norway. In September of 1991, two German hikers, Helmut and Erika Simon, crossing a high pass in the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy, found a body melting out of the ice at the edge of a rocky gully. They took it, at first, for a mountaineer lost in some recent accident, because a corpse coming out of a glacier is almost always a recent corpse. This one was not. The man in the ice had died on that spot more than 5,000 years earlier, and the cold had kept him so completely that his skin and his stomach and his clothing and his equipment had all come through the intervening age intact. He carried a copper axe and a longbow he had not yet finished shaping, and a quiver of arrows. He wore a cap of bear skin and shoes packed with grass for warmth, and the remains of his last meal were still inside him. For 10 years he was studied as a man who had lain down in the cold and died of exposure. Then, in 2001, an X-ray found what every earlier examination had missed. An arrowhead, lodged deep in his left shoulder, driven in from behind. The ice had preserved not only a man, but the manner of his death, and turned a 5,000-year-old accident into a 5,000-year-old killing, an unsolved one, reopened by the melt. The pattern runs clear across the world. In the mountains of the southern Yukon, retreating ice patches have given back the hunting gear of the First Nations who followed caribou onto the same summer ice for thousands of years. Dart shafts, and in the later layers, arrows, a whole technology visibly changing across time, and laid down in order in the snow, recovered now in partnership with the descendants of the people who left it. In the Rocky Mountains, in the high country of Yellowstone, and the ranges around it, the melt has exposed wooden implements, a woven basket of birch bark, and hunting weapons of comparable age. The specifics shift from place to place, the animals and the people, and the centuries each their own. What holds constant is the mechanism. Ice preserves what ordinary ground destroys. Organic things, wood and wool and leather and feather and flesh, the very materials that rot down to nothing within a few years anywhere else on Earth, survive inside a cold that will not release them, sometimes for thousands of years, right up until the day the cold finally lets go. And the response, wherever this happens, has hardened into the same shape. There is no time. An object that has waited 5,000 years in the ice does not, once the melt exposes it, wait 5 more. Wool starts to come apart, wood begins to warp and split and rot, and a feather that has kept its shape since before the first pyramid was raised can be gone inside a season or two of sun and rain and wind. The programs that work these sites, in Norway and the Alps and North America alike, run against that clock every single year, walking the melting margins in the short window when the ice sits lowest, gathering whatever has surfaced before the next winter buries it broken, or the next summer finishes it off entirely. Every object recovered is one that would otherwise have been lost outright, and behind every object recovered stands the near certainty of others, exposed in some season when no one happened to be watching, that surfaced and rotted and disappeared again with no one ever knowing they had been there at all. That last certainty is the one that changes how the whole record ought to be read. The written history of the high mountains was built on an absence, on the reasonable-looking assumption that the empty spaces on the map were empty, because little of consequence had ever happened in them. Lendbreen is the correction. For more than 1,000 years a route ran over the top of those mountains, carrying animals and goods and people in steady, ordinary numbers, and left behind more than 1,000 objects to prove it, and the written record took in none of it. No one hid this. The history came out wrong for a simpler reason, that the evidence had been set down in a place the historians could never reach, sealed in ice, and history quietly assumed that what it could not see had never existed. The mountains were never empty, they were only silent, and the silence was mistaken for the fact of the matter. And the mountains are only the plainest case of it. The same quiet assumption shapes a great deal of what we take the past to have been, that the record we hold is the whole of the record, that a blank space means an empty one, when a good share of what actually happened may simply have come to rest somewhere the writing could never follow. The objects themselves survive now in the one place, cold enough and careful enough to hold them, the conservation stores and freezers of the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo, where the tunic and the horseshoes and the arrows and the wooden whisk are kept at controlled temperatures against the decay that open air would set loose in them. The route survives as a line reconstructed out of the scatter of its own losses, drawn back onto maps that had never carried it, and the ice that kept all of it survives least of all. Lendbreen is smaller with every passing year, and thinner. The patches across the Norwegian mountains and the Alps and the Rockies and the Yukon are all shrinking together, and the same warming that has opened this record is the force that will eventually close it for good, by taking away the ice that made the preservation possible in the first place. Whatever has not yet melted out is living on borrowed time. Whatever melts out unwatched is already being lost. Return, at the end, to the garment in the meltwater in the autumn of 2011, and to Lars Pilø, standing over it on a mountain that no surviving map had ever called a road. A person made that tunic around the year 300, wore it, tore it, mended it, and carried it up onto the ice, and there, for reasons no record will ever recover, set it down and left it, where it lay through the fall of the Roman world, and the whole of the Viking Age, and the coming of the plague, and the long cold that followed, through every century of the history that was written without it, until the ice that had held it that entire time softened in one warm summer and laid it gently at the edge of the melt. It was not the only thing the mountain had been keeping. It will not be the last thing the ice gives back before it is gone. And it is a plain and unsettling reminder of what sits underneath all of this, that the record we have always treated as the whole of the past is only ever the part that survived where someone thought to look, and that for 1,000 years the rest of it lay a few feet overhead, under the ice, waiting for the weather to change. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.